Hey everyone, this is Christopher Luxon, the former CEO of Air New Zealand.
This is John Lee Dumas, the founder and host of Entrepreneurs on Fire.
This is Tracy Ibarra. I'm in Executive Solutions at Dell Technologies.
This is Travis Chappell, founder of Build Your Network. If you are wanting to learn how to embrace change,
To navigate through disruption as a leader,
Then listen to the Leadership is Changing podcast.
The Leadership is Changing podcast.
the Leadership is Changing podcast with my good friend,
my very good friend, Denis Giannoutsos.
Welcome to Leadership is Changing. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change. This is taking your leadership to another level by finding the balance between executive excellence and personal well-being through stories that inspire real change. It's time to adapt in our fast-moving world when leadership is changing with your host, Denis Giannoutsos.
Hey, welcome to the show, Leadership is Changing. What we as leaders know to be true is that change is constant. Leaders everywhere confront similar obstacles because people are people, but everywhere you go, leaders are overwhelmed, disrupted, and under pressure. They run from email to email, meeting to meeting. Many leaders are not changing quick enough, which means they run the risk of becoming irrelevant and being left behind. Perhaps the show is taking our listeners' leadership to another level by finding their balance between executive excellence and personal well-being through stories that inspire real change. I believe we don't have enough effective leaders in the world today, and if we can get the leaders to step up and lead change, then they can inspire real change. Hey listeners, it's now time to adapt in our fast-moving world. Welcome to today's episode of The Leadership is Changing Highlights 2021. This episode, I have three wonderful guests, and I'm going to introduce you to them very soon. Hey listeners, I would love you to go and help us out in the sense of putting a review and a rating. If you're getting a lot of value from these episodes, from this podcast, we would love you to go to the Apple side of things and put in a review and a rating. And if you are on Spotify, listening to this on Spotify has just announced or launched the ability to be able to put a rating. You're not able to put a review yet, but you can put a rating. And so we would love you to do that. I mean, today I got a message from one of the listeners saying how much they are loving podcast and how it is helping them stay ahead of the curve in what they're doing in their role as a leader. And it's just wonderful to get those kind of messages. All right, let's talk about today's episode. And I've got three wonderful guests from episode 201. Ian Clough. And Ian is a wonderful guy in Papua New Guinea. And his title of his episode is The Land of the Unexpected. Now, episode 204 is Larry Robertson. Now, Larry is an author, and one of his latest books is called Rebel Leadership. And if you haven't already checked that out, I encourage you to go and get that book. And the title of that episode is called Leaders Facing the Music in Uncertain Times. And episode 206, Simon O'Connor. Now, Simon was wanting to become a trainee priest, and then went into the corporate world. And today he is involved with politics. So wonderful to hear about his transition from those different types of roles that he has done. So listeners, take time now to listen to this episode and sit back. I encourage you to take notes and enjoy. Hey Ian, how did you get into leadership?
Look, I think I was fortunate enough to be surrounded by leaders as a child. My grandfather started the business. My father was obviously involved in the business at a senior level. I was influenced by people running a business and leading teams of people from a very early age. I decided to go and forge my own identity and learn a little bit more about retail outside of the Papua New Guinea environment and moved to Australia. And I came from an environment where you were expected to work hard all the time, and for me, as an early person, I didn't have aspirations to be a leader as such, but over time, just as a result of having an expectation that I worked hard, I was provided with opportunities, fortunately, to take on more significant roles, and slowly that formed some, leadership credibility amongst the people that I was working with, and I had some really strong mentors over the time that provided me opportunity to then take on more and more. And all of a sudden, one minute you're stacking shelves or doing things that just need to be done to suddenly responsible for and accountable for more significant parts of the business. So I'm fortunate that I'd argue that in some ways I was surrounded by it early and that influenced me very quickly. And others, I think I've just been fortunate that I've had good mentors that have identified that maybe I had some leadership qualities that were valuable and helped to steer me to a place where I could use those.
Yeah. Okay, good. So you mentioned a couple of things I want to do a little bit of a deep dive on. One is around your own identity. Do you think developing your own leadership identity is important?
I absolutely do, Dennis. I think that if I just talk personally for a minute, I was born into a family that had a small business that was growing. It was recognised as a teenager. You want to be your own person and recognised for your own skills, etc. And I was working in an environment where everyone knew who I was because of my father and my grandfather. So, when you get to 19 and everywhere you go, someone says, "Oh, you're Sir Brian's grandson," or "You're Trevor's son." I decided that maybe it was time that I went and learned some things and set my own course because, it was important that I built my own, I guess, credibility or brand as such, and decided off I'd go and do my own thing. The expectation was for a short period of time. It turned out to be much longer than that. I always tell people that I was a very slow learner, but I think that your own credibility, your own style, your own, I'm going to call it brand, but that's very important because when you talk about reputations, when you talk about integrity, authenticity is very important. And I think for me, it's really, really important that people identify what it is they stand for and work really hard to maintain that expectation of those people around them.
Yeah. That's good. Very good. So your brand, but there's so many things you've just covered off there, which is brilliant. The second area I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive on, and which is you talked about having some strong mentors around you. How important is it for people to actually think about who are either wanting to get into leadership or are at a certain leadership level, but they want to go to more senior levels or to a larger scale? How important is it for them to have mentors, and what should they do to try and find a mentor?
Look, Dennis, I think it's critical. I think that no one is going to realise their potential without support. I know that there's plenty of examples where people have, but I think that if they reflect on their journey, there will always be people that have influenced them either directly or indirectly. And so I think that having some people around you that can provide you with some steer, some direction, some guidance, some honesty around the things that you need to be doing to go to the places that you want to from a leadership perspective is a critical part of your development. And I've been very fortunate along the way that while I might not have realised it at the time, that I had people that were invested in my success and or at least me doing well, whether it was to support them in their roles or just to see me be the best that I could be. I think that's really important. I think it's important that you have close contacts, whether they're inside the business or outside your work environment, that know you well, that provide you with, that steer. I credit a lot of things to a lot of people, but I also can't underestimate the patience and tolerance of my wife, who, knows me better than anyone and just belts me around the head every now and then when it's time to say, well, this is what you need to have a good hard look at. And those sorts of conversations are really important.
Yeah, I think the words that you used before about having, them being honest and having some honesty with you and having that honest conversation, and you called it a belt around the head a couple of times, but, I think at the end of the day, it's really what we talk about is that there are people who have got, as you said, vested interest in you. They've got your back, but they've got your back in a good way in the sense that they want to look after you and make sure you succeed. And so having those honest conversations is going to be really important for sure. Hey, look, I've given a brief background to our listeners about you. And of course, you write a column for different magazines and so forth. Anything else that you like to share with us about your background?
Sure. I'll just shed a little light by pulling out of what you said, what I think is the most important. And that is that over the course of my career, 3 areas of expertise have dominated what I've done: creativity, entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial thinking, and leadership. And the reason I call myself an innovation advisor is because, those are three things that all of us admire in some way: creativity, ability to think like entrepreneurs do, leadership. Each of those actually is made more powerful by the combination of the three. And so my work as an innovation advisor is to help leaders, help organizations see that they need all three of those things, and that none of them are the domain of the few. They're actually the domain of the many, and that everybody can play a role in that.
Yeah, and I suppose when all three of them come together, that's where the magic happens, huh?
Absolutely. I mean, if you just take any one, too, it's pretty hard to be an entrepreneur and break new ground if you haven't practiced using your creative capacity. And similarly, if you're only the kind of person who breaks new ground as the entrepreneur and you never learn to lead, then the chances are that whatever value you create isn't going to last very long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there has to be a combination of all three, team listeners, as I'm talking about this, because together, as I said before, it's powerful. It's magic. Larry's saying it is powerful, and it's a great thing for all of us to work at. Larry, what happens do you have to be born with all those three different aspects, or is it something you need to work on to develop as a leader?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll pull two of them out to answer your question: creativity and leadership. Mm-hmm. These are, it's really interesting, Dennis. These are human capacities. Every one of us has a capacity we're born with it. It's standard factory issued equipment for creativity and for leadership. What makes us think that we don't, that only some are born this way or some can be the leader or be the innovator, is simply that we define things like creativity based on their outputs, right? So we look at a beautiful painting or a social movement or a score of music or whatever it might be, and we think that's creativity. That's not creativity. Creativity is the starting point, not the end point. So really the world is made up of the few people who know that we're all creative and practice that, know that we all lead in some way and practice that, and the rest of us who are kind of wrongly told we're not. And so we're out of practice.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So that's anything too, listeners. When you're going to the gym, if you're not out there developing the muscle and growing it and using it, it's not going to be used at all. And we tend to forget things. Well, when do people tend to be more creative? Is there a special time for that to happen? Is there a special environment for them to be more creative, or is it all the time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And so every now and then people come out, say writers, for instance, and they say, oh, it's always best to write in the morning, right? And then the next writer says, oh, it's always best to write in the afternoon or something like that. So no, there's no particular time. But the second thing you pointed out is really astute. There are particular environments where people are more creative. And this is really simple. It's environments where they're allowed to be so, where they're encouraged to be so. So think of a business, because, think of leaders in business. To the extent that we allow our entire team or our entire culture to think creatively without penalties and allowing for a hefty amount of experimentation, the data is off the charts proving that we are going to build more adaptable, more resilient, more versatile organizations, and that innovation, rather than being thought of as problem solving, is something that will kind of be in the tea, in the cup all the time. It's there, yes, to solve problems. It's also there to see opportunities. And frankly, it's a great way to be tuned in with what our assumptions are in any one moment, so that if they need to adjust, we can adjust them. So the environment has everything to do with it.
Oh, wonderful. And Larry, I really like, you mentioned a couple of times, and when you were just sharing us with that information just then, the word allow. I mean, I find with a lot of people, leaders and executives I work with around the world, whereby sometimes they don't give themselves the permission, or they're waiting for someone to give them permission around that. And I think, is that where you're getting at in relation to allowing themselves to be creative?
Yeah, very much so. And it applies not just to those who are designated the leaders, but to those they lead. So, in the broadest sense, I was talking about leaders have this fear that if they allow people to think creatively, to experiment, and importantly, to question, that somehow all hell is going to break loose. And like I said, especially when times are uncertain or changing constantly, the data is off the charts the other way to say that locking down actually creates a more restrictive ability to adapt in any particular circumstance. But this is really interesting to really pick up on your thought there. Leaders think this way about themselves. They think that they are supposed to play some kind of heroic role, always have the answer, always know what direction to go, always deliver a positive rather than a negative. And so leaders locking themselves into that kind of thinking rather than being open, and really at the core of creativity is openness. That's what really makes them more successful over the long term. So it's a lesson for leaders and not just for the people they lead.
Yeah. Hey, leaders, others, be vulnerable with it, with the creativity side. Open yourself up, as Larry's saying. I think that's really cool. It's some real fascinating stuff that you're sharing here, Larry, for sure. So you've written some books, and one of them is Rebel Leadership. And that. How did you get into leadership?
Well, I listened to quite a few of your episodes, and I would say that I come at the answer to that a bit differently than some of your guests, because I've been in both angles of leadership, the more traditional roles, playing a leadership role in different organizations as a founder, as a member of startup teams and otherwise. But I've also been in this position of advising leaders, guiding them, researching leadership and where it's effective, especially when leaders are under pressure. So that's in my role as an advisor, but also as a board member, an investor in different organizations, and in my writing roles. And so it's that combination of things that has always had me realize that you need to take a 360-degree view of leadership. And I feel like I've experienced that by being in those various roles, but I also feel that my mission professionally in life has become to remind people that they can't just see it from one perspective. From the top down or the bottom up, or even from the outside looking in, you've got to look at leadership in that broader 360-degree view if you want to understand how to effectively lead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good points, because I think the 360-degree assessment or view, as you say, is very important. We can catch ourselves out, we'll be caught out if we don't actually take that 360-degree view. And I think what you're saying there, Larry, is that for a lot of leaders, when their back's up against the wall, in other words, there's a lot of pressure, crisis, things going on for them, there's like this other person comes out out and goes, ta-da, and everyone goes, yeah. Whoa, where was that person? And it may not always be a good thing. And I think I like what you're saying is a 360-degree view of leadership is really, really important.
Yeah, and I'll add one thing to that. There's an HR approach, a human resources approach called the 360-degree review. That is not what I'm talking about here. So that's a tactic that says, let's look every now and then at the end of a quarter, at the end of a year, and let's take this 360-degree temperature reading of how I'm doing as a leader or how every member of the team is doing. I'm talking about living this. I'm talking about having that 360-degree view every single day of the year, not just of yourself, not just inbound people critiquing you and saying positive and negative or whatever. No, it's thinking in 360 degrees what leadership really means. And what leadership really means is not this big equal sign between the leader and leadership. Leadership is something bigger, and it encompasses the whole organization. That's where the 360 comes from.
Wow. Hey, listeners, it's not a tick in the box that we're talking about here. It is actually bring it to life. And actually, as Larry's saying, living it and being their leader. But it's the way we think about things. It's the way we look at things. It's the way we do things. It's everything. It's the whole package rather than just a tick in the box because it's a review time. And that's where a lot of people do that, right? So, yeah, it's really quite interesting. Simon, a big welcome to you.
G'day, Denis. Oh, great to join you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Awesome. Great to have you here with us. And just for our listeners here, I've given them a brief introduction to you. Tell us a little bit more about your background.
Well, it's slightly eclectic, but let's start with the simple part. So before Parliament, actually, I used to work for Southern Cross Health Society. So that's your health insurance. And wasn't the salesman. My role was to negotiate all the contracts with the various doctors, specialists, and hospitals across the country. So contract relations, negotiations has been a big part of my background. In the private sector before Parliament. I was in the public sector before that, used to do the negotiation for the Ministry of Social Development on their social programs. And then the slightly quirky part of my background, Denis, is I spent my 20s training as a Catholic priest. So I suspect this might be the first ex-seminarian you've had on your podcast. I don't know, but I spent 9 years, training as a priest. And that came with a whole lot of different experiences too.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. And tell me, the transition between being a priest or becoming a priest into the public sector, then into the private sector, and now back into the public sector, what have those transitions been like for you?
Not as difficult as you might think, and that's not to presume your own thinking, but it wasn't too difficult. I mean, particularly moving from trainee priest life to politicians, probably easier than people realize. To be completely blunt, church politics is far more brutal than it is in parliamentary politics. But also, I suppose, in those years of seminary training, you're being trained for leadership, for responsibility. So that translated quite well into Parliament. And I suppose in my public and then private roles, the fact that I had to be engaging and talking and understand people, those are some good transferable skills there too.
Yeah, cool. And is that how you got into leadership?
Yeah, well, I think yes. Yeah, I mean, look, if my family were here, they would tell you that right from a young age, I've always been an opinionated something.
Yeah.
Very opinionated. So even in my school days was always getting involved in things. But I suppose that training in the 20s particularly helped me, if you will, hone some leadership, because that's what you're being formed up to be. And people look to you to lead in different ways. Eventually, it wasn't for me, partly because actually I wanted to get into politics, wanted to get into Parliament. And for whatever reason, which I'm grateful for, I managed to achieve that.
Yeah, wonderful. And tell me, even from when you were a kid and that wanting to get involved in things, I mean, I think that's quite important for leaders to put their hand up and step forward and do things. What are your thoughts on that? Should they be putting their hand up more often? Should they be stepping up to things?
I think so. I mean, there's always going to be different forms of leadership, but in general terms, I think you do have to lead and lead by example and lead from the front. I mean, the historian in me doesn't particularly like part of that when you think about all the officers leading from the front in various battles and first to be shot. But I think actually there's a real place for leadership by example, and it's certainly something I've tried to follow in my journey across various roles in leadership.
Okay, cool. And you've talked about the historian side of you. So here's my next question to you, and that is, who's your favorite leader? Now, this person can be alive or can be from history. So who's your favorite leader and why?
I always hate this question. But look, the one that's been on my mind of late, actually, he's dead, William Wilberforce, actually. Probably most well known because of his anti-slavery work. And I suppose that's part of what inspires me. But he was also the first to work for animal welfare, prison reform, which I'm slightly, having been a prison chaplain, sort of grateful for that. So he's someone who did a remarkable array of things in themselves. But I think what stands out for me with Wilberforce was his just utter determination. He just didn't give up. And I love that about him.
Yeah, I think that's an important trait for a lot of us in life today is don't give up. And I think that's really, really important. And interesting how you mentioned him, because Wilberforce is a street that I grew up in Wilberforce Street in Wellington, actually. I grew up in that street. And yeah, so it's interesting you mentioned his name for sure. And it's the determination and not giving up with things is really important for us. And for a lot of people, it's just easy to roll over and just give up.
Yep.
I think that's one trait that a lot of leaders need to have today. What's one thing or two things that you think that leaders probably need to have to be able to have that determination, that grit, that do not give up? What do you think they should do?
I think a big part of it, I've certainly found in the political realm, you've got to understand what you stand for and why. So if you're going to be in a position of leadership trying to guide, if you're going to be leading a team, if you've got a vision for your sales targets, or in my case, policy in Parliament, you as the leader have to understand what you're asking for at such a level that you can easily and readily articulate it to people. I suppose it comes from another part of my academic background that if you can't explain an idea to someone quickly and simply, you yourself don't understand it. So yeah, leaders knowing what they think, and importantly knowing then why. Lots of people will be very emotive and expressive of what they believe, but when you press them for why is it? That's often, I find, lacking. So I think that's a critical element in leadership.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's beautiful what you just said there, because on the surface, it sounds good, or it's the emotional side of things. But as you scrape that surface or dive a little bit deeper, there's nothing there, or it's just not happening. So I think you're right. I mean, a lot of leaders do need to actually understand that why. And in particular, when things get hard or difficult for us, if we don't know the why and we don't understand, then we will give up. Otherwise, But if we do know the why, then that's what's really going to help us stay on course and where we're going.
Look, absolutely. It also means that you can have a proper and full conversation with people, including have very different opinions. I mean, again, probably not unsurprising to your listeners, in politics it's divisive, but actually some of the best and easiest conversations I've had is with opponents who equally and clearly know why they think. It makes a robust, often respectful conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. And There's nothing worse than having leaders who don't know where they're going, don't know their why, or don't even make a decision. And I think even if they do have a decision or a why and it's opposing, that's cool. Have that conversation, have that debate, but then also listen to what the others are saying too. And hey, you might be surprised and learning something else from someone else.
Look, exactly right. And you've always got to be open to learning more. I mean, this is the paradox or the flip side. You have to have the confidence in your opinion. You have to understand why. But in reverse, you must always be open to understanding where others are coming from. They can be equally as strong and as grounded as you, but different. And so it's a constant engagement, learning. And I think that is an important part of leadership.
Wow. I wouldn't imagine, would you, that being a priest versus being a politician, that there are certain things that are very similar and certain things that Simon has just shared. So there was Simon O'Connor from episode 206, Larry Robertson from 204, and Ian Clough from episode 201. Now, if you haven't already heard those episodes, I'm going to encourage you to go back, go and listen to them. And if you have already heard them, I'm going to encourage you to go back and listen to them again. For all of us, we will pick up things at different times in our career and where we are when we listen to things and re-listen to it and re-listen to it. So go ahead and check them out. Now, listeners, if you haven't already gone ahead and put a review and a rating on Apple or a rating on Spotify, we would love you to go ahead and do that because the actual ratings and the reviews help the visibility of the podcast globally, and people start to see more and more of this podcast, and we can attract more listeners. So we'd love you to go ahead and do that. Now, team, what I'm going to encourage you to do is just go along, put those reviews and ratings, and thank you in advance for doing it. Hey, listeners, what we as leaders know to be true is that change is constant. Change is incredibly scary, especially with the unknown and unfamiliar territory. It's time to adapt in our fast-moving world when leadership is changing. Look out for the episodes as they're being released, download them, have a listen, put a review and a rating. Feel free to share them with your friends, your family, and your network. Hey, if there's any feedback you'd like to give me about the show, or if there's a question you have for the Ask Denis freestyle episode, then send me an email, dennis@leadingchangepartners.com. Hey, listeners, it's always a pleasure being with you. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, bye for now.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leadership is Changing with your host, Denis Giannoutsas. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change, inspiring executives and leaders to adapt and lead a bigger game in a fast-moving world.